During the college days, a common study mistake that I did was only studying during the exam. So, whenever exams were close, I would try to study that topic and I could perform decently in the exam. But in the next semester, when I tried to recall those subjects, if it was related to some previous subject, then I had a difficult time, and most of those knowledge or information was lost from my memory. So when we are trying to prepare for competitive exam, or if we want to remember anything in long term, then the same technique does not work. I think many of you would also have experienced this. So in this video, we will be talking about the different studying methods, and among those, the most effective learning methods that we should be following to keep our learning for long term. So first of all, we should see something called a forgetting curve. The forgetting curve was given by a German psychologist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, in the year 1885, and it is a plot between retention versus time. So once we have studied or once we have learned something, the retention for that reduces exponentially over time, and only in a few days we completely forget whatever we had studied. But we can break this curve by revising at suitable intervals. So once we revise enough number of times at suitable intervals, then this curve flattens out. To study and to recall any topic or any subject, there are various methods which are more effective than the methods that we have followed so far in our life. In a study conducted in 2013 by John Dunlowski, various studying methods were reviewed. The scientific research on these methods were reviewed, and based on that, a few of these methods were found to be highly effective. Among those, we have practice test, distributed practice, and interleaved practice. Here we will be seeing about these three methods. So first, if we talk about the practice test here means recalling the information that we have already learned with the help of some tests with feedback. In a study in 2010, students were divided in two groups, and both of these groups, initially they were exposed to some text, and later one of the groups was allowed to restudy or reread the material, and the other group was tested with a practice test with feedback. A week later, these students were tested, and the students who had given the practice test outperformed the students who went for rereading the text. In another study conducted in 2012, students in an online course were checked. So after each class, students could take practice activity up to 4 times. Some of this information was presented in the form of test, some was presented in the form of restudy, and some information was not presented. Later in the unit exam, the grades were higher for information that had been practice tested compared to the information that was restudied. And the same was true for repeated questions as well as for new related questions. So the questions that were not even the part of initial practices. The idea behind practice tests is that when we try to recall the information from our existing knowledge from our brain, then it forms new connections and new pathways to access that information. And also, as we are recalling, we generate new cues, and with the help of these cues, it is easier to recall this information later. The second studying method is distributed practice. So distributed practice, it means that rather than trying to study everything at once, we distribute our study sessions over time. In a study conducted in 1979, students learned translations of Spanish words to a different language. Then these students participated in 6 additional sessions in which they could retrieve and relearn the translations. Now there were 3 conditions in this study. In the first case, it was zero spacing condition, which means the 6 study sessions, they were back to back, and the learning was rapid across these sessions. In the second condition, the sessions were 1 day apart, so slightly more forgetting could take place. And the third condition had a gap of 30 days. Now we can see the result for this study. In the immediate gap or zero spacing condition, the students could immediately remember everything that they had initially learned by the end of 6 sessions. The same was true in the 1 day spacing session also. Initially, students had a lower correct proportion, but over time, over the different sessions, it increased. But when the gap was 30 days, when these sessions were spaced by 30 days, even by the sixth session, students could not remember everything. The key point from this study is that in case of 30-day gap, initially the students could not remember, but by the later study sessions, students showed a very high percentage increase. And this information, if you see, for 30-day gap, so the last session took place 6 months later, and by then students had a much higher retention compared to the first session. In another study conducted in 2008, it was seen the criterion performance was best when the lag between sessions was approximately 10 to 20% of the desired retention interval, which means if we want to recall something a week later, then learning should be spaced by 12 to 24 hours, and if we want to remember something 5 years later, then the learning should be spaced 6 to 12 months apart. So distributed practice, it can be understood with the help of forgetting curve, and as we saw, by breaking the forgetting curve by revising or recalling the information at different intervals, we could break the curve and keep the information for longer duration. Then the next studying technique is interleaved practice. Interleaved practice means that when we are studying a topic or practicing it, we should interleave it with another subject or another topic. So when we mix these topics and try to solve the mixed problems, then the retention is better compared to if we only study one topic and practice only that topic. In a study conducted in 2007 for interleaved practice, students were taught to find the volume of geometric solids. So there were 4 geometric solids, and related to that there were 16 practice problems, 4 problems for each solid. One of the groups solved these problems in the block of 4, that is 4 problems of the same solid, whereas the second group solved these problems in the interleaved manner, that is 4 problems at a time, but all 4 problems from different geometric solids. These students were tested twice, first right after completing the practice and the second a week later. So in the first case, right after they practiced to find the volume, the performance for students who had used the blocked approach, that is finding the volumes for same solid, performed better. So their performance was better, but when the test was repeated a week later, then the performance of the students who did interleaved practice was far better than the blocked students. So in case of interleaved practice, students get to solve different questions from different concepts at the same time, so they are able to make better connections, and the same is reflected when they are tested later. So these were the most useful studying techniques that are backed by science, and these techniques can help with long-term retention. And as students who are preparing for competitive exams, or as any learner who wants to retain the information for a very long duration, it is really useful to use these techniques rather than just relying on the old learning methods that we have been using since our school days. One of the major problems in these methods is that we feel like we are not learning anything. If we are attempting a practice test after some time of studying the subject, we will have difficulty in answering the question. But that difficulty itself is what helps in learning anything for long term. If the learning is easy, then it's actually not learning. We will be forgetting whatever we are studying if it feels easy. Learning should be effortful, and only then we reap the benefit of learning or retention in long term. So I hope you found this video useful. If you have any question to ask, you can ask in the comments, and also like this video and share with your friends who would find it useful.